Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I have a really nice conversation with the writer, the designer, and publisher Adrian Shaughnessy. Adrian, along with Tony Brook, who I talked to a few months ago, is the co-founder of Unit Editions, the great publisher of design books and monographs for people like Paula, Scher, Lubalin, Lance Wyman. But Adrian is also a prolific writer and has written for publications like I and Design Observer, and a book of his collected essays called Scratching the Surface, which is a great title, were published in 2013. Before transitioning to a career in writing, Adrian worked as a designer and ran his own studio for many years. But my first introduction to Adrian's work came almost 15 years ago, actually, when as a high school student, I bought his now seminal book, How to Be a Graphic Designer Without Losing Your Soul. I'm pretty sure it was the first design book that I ever owned, and I just loved how he wrote about the field and how to work as a designer. So I've been following his work for basically as long as I've been interested in design, and it was great to finally get a chance to talk to him. In this episode, Adrian and I talk about his early interest in design and how he started writing. We talk about the similarities between editing and art direction, writing for a general audience, and how the discourse has changed over the course of his career. This was a special one for me, I think it pairs really well with my interview with Tony. There are only a few people who have been as dedicated to design writing as Adrian has, so I am honored to have had this chance to talk with him for the podcast. So here is my conversation with Adrian Shaughnessy. I kind of wanted to start talking to you. Your book, How to Be a Graphic Designer Without Losing Your Soul, was literally, I think, the first graphic design book that I ever bought when I was in high school, and was very seminal to kind of my very early design education. But the reason I bring it up is that my whole knowledge of your work, you had already kind of transitioned to being a writer. But you had a design career before that, and so I'm kind of interested in that early design career and then that transition to being a writer.
Well, it was a very gradual, a very slow change, but I didn't go to design school. I trained in a studio in the pre-digital age, and I was trained by. They weren't told they had to train me, but as long as I asked politely, these very experienced guys would show me how things worked. And I realised that after kind of drifting a bit in my early life, I realised that here was something I think I could do, this graphic design business. And I was actually employed as which I'm the least qualified person in the world to do this, but I was employed as a copy checker, checking artwork. And but when I saw old-fashioned mechanical paste-up, mechanical artwork, I instinctively understood it. I just knew, I had a real sense of how this could work and that I could do it. And eventually I got taken on as a trainee, and quite quickly I was able to start functioning. So it sort of saved my life in a way, because I was drifting hopelessly. Who knows where I might, what pit I might have ended up in, but this was the thing I could do. And after some kind of pretty dreadful jobs, I eventually set up my own studio in about, I think it was about 1989. Okay.
So where did the writing piece of that come in?
That came much, much later. That was...
Okay.
So I mean, I say later, I'd always been interested in the written word, and I'm an avid reader, and but I didn't feel that this was something I could do, whereas graphic design I felt I could do. So
interesting.
The ambition, if you like, was parked. The writing ambition was parked. And weird thing happened. My studio, we set up in '89, and through the 90s, we did really well. We did a lot of work and we grew. And towards, I suppose it was mid-90s, suddenly I was having to write proposals all the time. So clients would come and they would say, but what are you really going to do, and how will you approach it? So I ended up writing, and it was also kind of a way of saying we're not doing free work. I would say, well, look, I'll write you a proposal. And we were also doing things like music videos, so I would write treatments for music videos.
Okay.
And I realised that you had to be really concise. You had to be so sharp with your writing, because these guys just don't have time for this. And I just felt it was such a good discipline. And I suddenly realised that a huge part of my time was spent writing these proposals. And then I thought, I've got to take this skill or whatever it was that I'd acquired. And as you mentioned that one of your entry points was the kind of the blogs and the design discourse of the early 2000s, and I'd been involved in, or I'd been very interested in the design discourse. I really felt engaged with it, but I realised if you wanted to be part of it, you had to be a writer.
Right.
And so I felt that this was what this was where I would take this ability to write concisely, and I would channel it into writing about design. So I had a few things published in British design magazines, and suddenly I realised I was in demand. I was getting asked to do stuff, and thought, okay, maybe this is something that I can keep doing.
Right. I mean, that's why it's interesting. I mean, kind of what you just articulated is why you were interesting to me, is because you had a seemingly successful design practice, and it seemed very quickly, pivoted into being a writer. Yeah. Were you kind of conscious of that at the time?
No, not at all. It was a very slow. It seems to have pivoted, but it wasn't. It was a slow process, and It sort of, I suppose it also grew up. It was also kind of forced in a way, or encouraged by the fact that towards the end of, I don't know, get my dates right, I suppose towards the end of the 90s, I kind of fell out of love a bit with clients and this whole sort of dance and ballet we have to do to keep our clients happy. Actually, I was really good at it. It was something I could do. And like anything else you can do in life, you're not that impressed. So I thought, I don't want to spend the rest of my life doing all this kind of client stuff. And writing seemed to be one of the very few ways that you could bypass, that you could become your own client in a way. Although obviously you have editors and you have commissioners and things, but writing just felt freer than design. So it wasn't an overnight thing. It was a slow process. Really, the first thing I did that made me realise that maybe I could do this was and I'm eternally grateful to him, but Rick Poyner, when he was editor of I, and I was very impressed with I. I thought I was just what the design world needed in the 90s. And Rick commissioned a long piece for me about the German music label ECM.
Oh yeah.
And he said a funny thing. He said, look, when he eventually commissioned it, he said, now look, please understand that that we have very high standards on I, and if you don't meet those standards, I'm going to have to reject it, or I'm going to have to edit the shit out of you. So this was a great challenge. I thought, you're not touching my copy. And But it made me write a piece that, and he, to his credit, he acknowledged that it was I standard, which was very flattering.
Okay, good.
That was a relief. But that was a great moment because I realised I'd passed a certain test, and then just kept writing, just kept looking at design from the. I was very conscious of the fact that I wanted to be a practitioner writer.
Okay.
I wanted to keep some kind of sense of practice in my writing and not become a completely objective, completely objective. I wanted to write from the viewpoint of a working designer.
Right. I mean, that was exactly what my next question was going to be, kind of, because you had mentioned earlier that any kind of writing ambitions that you had were kind of parked and you were focused on this design career, but then you started getting commissions to write pieces. Did your writing ambitions change then, where you saw yourself being a full-time writer? Did you always want to keep the design piece involved?
Yes. The life of a full-time, at the point I'd reached in my life, I actually gave up studio life. I left my studio. Right. It was a very amicable split, but I just thought, I don't want to keep doing this. And I did imagine that I would spend a lot of my time writing. And in reality, I suppose I spent 50% of my time. And then I got sort of slightly sucked back into mainly sort of consultancy work. But the thing that I loved to do was design. But I was writing. And it was a case of two things really. People coming to me and asking me to write about certain subjects, and also me going to people and saying, hey, I've just found this, I'd really like to write about this. And also very, very important was hooking up with Design Observer, because that was an absolute joy while it was, it's an interesting conversation to be had about why Design Observer isn't what it used to be. I've got some views on that, but it was, what a joy to have that platform. Huge readership, massive readership. And basically Jessica and Bill, Michael and Rick at that time, they never once told me what to write. It was an open platform. So that was hugely important to me. And it's a bit of a sadness that it doesn't exist in that format anymore. I think I know why, and you may have views as well, but it's a shame, because that was a wonderful platform.
Yeah, I mean, and I would like to come back to that if we can, because I do have, it is something that has come up a lot with people that I've talked to, in that, especially in the 90s, there was this kind of very big interest in design writing and theory and criticism, and then blogs like Design Observer kind of took that up in the 2000s, and then, now when I kind of talk to people about design writing and criticism, a lot of the complaints that come up are that there's no kind of platform for it, or it's so dispersed now that there's just all these kind of dialogues happening in their own places and no one kind of collecting them anymore.
I think it's a very valid criticism, and it's a correct observation that these platforms that existed briefly. My own feeling is that social media swept them away. Mm-hmm. I think people who would write a sort of, 2,500 word text on some subject, it's now a Facebook post, or it's more likely it's a Twitter, 140 characters on Twitter. And that's, if you like, because one of the great things, although for the writers it was a wonderful platform, but where the magic really took place on Design Observer was in the comments.
Yeah, everyone has said that.
Yeah, there were comments that were better than the original, the original post.
Right.
And often I would read some comments, and it would just make me kind of, make me want to write my piece again, because some smart guy somewhere, some smart person had spotted something, and it was sometimes it was humiliating. But usually it was enlightening, and then people would go off and have their own conversation. So that doesn't exist. That was a beautiful little thing, and I think, interestingly enough, the place where I see that happening most is in education. I think that debate now is carried on in academia, but I do not see it taking place in the profession or the industry.
Do you think that kind of discourse that is more than an Instagram post or 140 characters is even still possible today? Like, do you think that could ever come back in some form?
Uh, I can't see it coming back because I can't see anybody. I mean, one of the things to say about Design Observer, it was a big sacrifice for everybody.
Right.
You did towards the end. Actually, funnily enough, there was some payment, but all this at its height, no one got paid.
Right.
And I suppose that eventually wears people out. It's you can do it for a while, and I was delighted to do it. I didn't have a problem. But suddenly you realise you've just written 30,000 words and no one's.
Right.
That wasn't the reason. It opened other doors too. People would ask you to do things because of.
Yeah.
No, I don't. To go back to your question, I don't see a place for this anymore. Other than I think it takes place in academia, and then when those students who've indulged in that discourse, when they go off, they're better informed. They have much more of a grounding in design culture and the design discourse. So that's where, and I think a lot of the tutors are in institutions are of an age that they grew up with that Design Observer,
right,
and other things too. I mean, you'd have to include things like Emigre, and Stephen Heller's AIGA posts. It wasn't just Design Observer, but I think there was that wonderful moment when Design Observer absolutely led the field.
Right. I have one other question kind of about that change, and I'm curious kind of for you and your own writing process. Has the switch even from kind of print to blogs to now social media, has that changed, one, how you write and your writing process, but then also kind of what you write about and how you think about the topics you're writing about?
That's interesting. Not really, because I tried to I tried not to write differently for blogs or for print. So if I wrote something for Creative Review or something, I would pretty much approach it in the same way. There is that wonderful thing that you can do with blogs is you can post links. You can embed links, and I sometimes miss that when you're writing for print. But I don't see a difference really, but in writing for. In fact, I think people trained and raised in print actually make better use of blogs because they have that editorial discipline, perhaps. I mean, I think they're wonderful people writing purely for blogs, but I think to have had experience of working with a rigorous editor like someone like Rick, it really helped me when it came to writing for blogs and things. So no, I don't see a difference.
Okay. What about, I'm curious kind of when you first started writing, was your writing process, did you notice differences between your process for writing versus your design process, or did those overlap at all?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've often thought about this. I think it's, with my design hat on, I mean, certainly laterally with my studio, I was much more of a creative director, art director than I was hands-on designer. I pretty much, I gave up being a kind of, sculptor on the screen. I gave that up quite a long time ago. And so most of the time it was working with the design team, being the link between clients and designers, and really dealing with ideas. So in a way I feel that not so much writing, but maybe editing and art direction, editing and creative direction, they're quite similar processes. They're about making decisions. They're about kind of organising material, but they're not doing the kind of the heavy lifting. So I see a parallel there. But writing, I think, is certainly writing for me is a slow, painful, and it's. I only love it when it's finished. I've often thought about this, and what other parallels, but all I would say is that, you want to do anything well in life, it takes 10 times longer than you think, And
Right.
you just must never be satisfied. As soon as you're satisfied with something, it's no good, because
Right.
you just got to keep that kind of endless nagging. And so I go back to pieces I've written, but the 5 minutes before I've got to submit it, I'm tweaking it, and I think many designers are like that too. They're constantly finessing and refining. So there are parallels, but they're also different.
Do you find, that's interesting, and this was not a question that I was planning on asking, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. About a year and a half ago or so, about a year ago, I got your book of essays, also called Scratching the Surface, actually, which I had somehow missed. But, as I was kind of immersing myself and trying to read as much about design as I could to start this project, I finally picked up that book and read through it cover to cover. And I'm curious, it's interesting now thinking about that book and thinking about what you were just saying about kind of always editing and kind of, those last minute changes. Do you find yourself returning to similar topics again from, different angles, or maybe an old essay, your views have changed or you feel like you didn't get it and so you come back? Like, do you think there's like an overarching theme to a lot of your work?
I would say no.
Okay.
But I think obviously I'm not in a way I'm not the best person to ask that question to, because there are certain things that I'm interested in, but I'm very conscious of the fact that if you start repeating yourself, you're also kind of run the risk of being dead in the water. So I try and avoid that. Maybe this is something you want to talk about a bit later, but one of the big change, if you like, is that I've become interested in design history. Mm-hmm. And that led to the setting up with Tony of the publishing company.
Right.
And I suppose really that's where my interest lies now. So I'm still. I've just funny enough, I've just written a piece. I've just come back from China, and I spent 3 weeks in China, and I've just written about China, and it was very. There's so much to say about China because it's just unbelievable.
Right.
And I suddenly realised, I'm writing it for a design magazine, and I suddenly realised, hey, I haven't even mentioned design yet. I haven't even got to design. So.
Oh wow.
I don't want to repeat. I don't like to repeat myself, but I'm interested in, the political and the cultural makeup of anything. So I tend to gravitate to those themes, but also the aesthetic. I love aesthetics and the fact that these things can be just amazing to look at. So I suppose I tend to gravitate around those themes.
Yeah, I was going to say, something that I've always liked about your writing is that you do, and it's the kind of design writing that I'm most interested in, and the type of design writing that I think I probably try, not always successfully, but try to write myself, is the writing that does talk about the aesthetics, but also is bringing in political, cultural, social, economic, everything outside of design into it to kind of help explain or talk about these things. I'm curious, though, kind of related to that, someone who has started their studio in the late 80s and has kind of been writing now for, at least 20 years, almost, I don't know exactly how to phrase this. I'm curious about your commitment, and you mentioned this early, that you always had a deep interest in the design discourse. I'm curious about your commitment to that discourse, and I'm thinking about everything from your books to the radio show that you did, to unit editions, that you've really committed now a large part of your career to kind of furthering that discourse. Where's that interest come for you, but then also kind of what's the value in that you see for the profession at large?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, maybe it's something for somebody else to judge. But I'm just interested in design as a practice and design as a culture, and also a friend of mine recently, he teaches, he runs a kind of big design course. And I spent some time with these students, and I said, all they're interested in is design. They're not interested in, when I was that age, I was into music and subcultures and stuff. And he said, no, they're into the design tribe. They are members of the design tribe. And I suddenly thought that was there is now such a thing as a design tribe. And I feel that, maybe that's where I live now. I live in that world. And pretty much everything I do is for the tribe. It's for people who are interested in, certainly it's led to unit editions, which is a really huge and important part of my life now. So whether it's got any value, I don't know, but it has value for me. I like designers. I like the way they think. I understand them too. I never have to sort of struggle to, even designers who are working in very, very different areas from me. I instinctively understand them, and I also I feel a little bit, and this is maybe a little bit pompous, and I don't go around shouting this, but I feel a bit evangelical about design. I really want people to understand that it has a value, and that's a bit of a cliche, but it's. I like talking. Although I've said, my world is the tribe. I love being able to talk to people outside the tribe and say, well, this is what design can do. This is why design is important. So,
That was. You started answering what my next question was going to be. Something I'm very interested in is the idea of audience and who design writing is for, and so much of it is for us. And I'm always curious about who else could this be of value to, and here in the States, and I'm not sure what it's like where you are, that a lot of newspapers will have architecture critics and music critics, and is there any value in a design critic at the New York Times, for example?
Yeah. I would love to think so, but I when I hear designers and commentators and design writers complain about this, I have a slightly different reaction. I think, well, whose fault is this? And I actually think it's our fault. I don't think it's the fault of newspaper owners. I mean, there's something huge going on in media anyway, and film critics are being got rid of them by the yard, and because that's something that's moved on to social media. Who needs a film critic when you can go on Twitter and see, get the views of 1,000 people? But I think it's down to design writers to make design writing better and make it something that really appeals to, and I could just give you one example of someone that in the 60s and 70s there was a wonderful British, and he eventually went to the US. There was a man called Rainer Banham.
Oh yeah.
Everybody knows Rainer Banham, and he I can read Rainer Banham, and it's, my granny would get something out of Rainer Banham. I mean, he has a way of writing that is not elitist, that is not closed. It's open, and it's culturally astute. And I think design writers need to take something from him. There are other examples. There are people who, again, another Brit, but Owen Hatherley.
I don't know him.
Really interesting writer, and he can talk. He basically writes about architecture, but he writes in a way that is not for the profession. And so I think when writers say, "Oh, it's a shame we can't be published in," then whose fault is that? Really, we need to think about it.
Yeah, I mean that reminds me of, this is something that I talk to a lot of people about, because it's something that is very deeply frustrating to me, is that for so long designers have kind of complained that they weren't seen as valuable in culture, or that they wanted a seat at the table, or kind of whatever, and that now we live in a place where for the most part, everybody knows what design is and kind of understands it on a surface level. And then when we, now that we have that, a company redesigns their logo, and then every designer just turns to Twitter to complain about, the kerning on it or something. And it's like now we have that chance, and we're kind of wasting it on talking about, kerning or typeface selection or something.
Yeah, I think so. You could say that that's not the fault of design writers, that's the fault of designers themselves.
Right.
But I think it's a shame that there isn't really enough good. There is good design writing, but there's not enough of it. There's not enough to make a difference. There's not enough for people to say, wouldn't it be great if we had,
right.
Someone who could. And it can't just be graphics. That's the other thing. It has to
right.
be. It has to be design in the widest sense. But you can see signs of it. Magazines like Wired and Fast Co. They now treat. They now do give space to design, but you wouldn't call it deep analysis. It's fairly superficial, but it's an example of how it does exist, but perhaps not in the way that we'd ideally want it to exist.
I'm interested in what you think. This is a question that I ask everybody that I talk to. What are the topics or issues that designers should be talking about, or design writers should be writing about, kind of right now, 2017?
Yeah. Well, the easy answer to that is artificial intelligence. AI.
Mm-hmm.
I think AI is the biggest single issue facing the world, really. Because I read something the other day that in the future, anything that can be automated will be automated.
Right.
And
right.
I think you can see within design there is there are people working on artificially intelligently generated design. So that's coming. And what does that mean for designers? And I don't really see much discussion about it. There's been a few things. So I would say in terms of the profession, that's the most important thing. But beyond that, I'd say education.
Right.
I think education is a absolutely vital issue. My own feeling is that in many institutions produce students who are ahead of the curve, who are actually more advanced than
right.
their professional counterparts. And this is both a good thing and a problematical thing, because where do they fit in? So I'd say that's another big issue. And then, of course, the culture, the political and economic situation. How
right.
how do you make money as a designer in the coming years?
Right.
How do you do it now? And things like we have in this country, we have things like 0-hour contracts, and so I think there's a huge slew of really important issues. Some that apply directly to design, but generally they're things that apply to anybody who works, basically.
Yeah, that's interesting. I found that the writing that I'm most interested in now is not kind of critiques of work, but are more critiques of the practice or the profession, and looking at all those the system of graphic design. So that's really interesting. My last question is I'm just kind of curious who the writers or the critics are that have influenced you, and maybe that's kind of when you first started writing, who are the people that you kind of look to, and then also now, who are the people that you're kind of, really interested in?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mentioned earlier that I didn't go to design school. I don't have a university education. Anything I know, I've had to teach myself. But one of the things that I grew up on was critical writing. Critics reviewing literature,
interesting.
films, and music. And I've been a music fan all my life, and so particularly in the 70s, the standard of music criticism was just fantastic. In the UK, we had a weekly publication called the NME, the New Musical Express,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and the writing in that was, it wasn't disciplined writing, but it was on fire. It was just full of
Right.
this amazing kind of reflections on life and music and culture. And I would say that's where I got my, apart from reading, classic novels like Orwell and people like that, my first ambition was to be a music writer. I thought that's what I would do.
Oh, okay.
And that just didn't happen. And so I would hold up critical writing. I used to read reviews all the time, and so I was educated by reviews.
Yeah.
No, it's harder to pick people out to mention now. I mentioned Owen Hatherley as an architectural critic that I'm very impressed with. People like Rick Poyner and Steve Heller, I think, are both still, giants.
Yeah.
Rick is less, active in the design field. He's more interested in photography now, but he writes with great clarity, and Steve, because of my interest in design history, I find that Steve is always someone that I can turn to and get something from. So my favourite reading is the London Review of Books. Long reviews of not just fiction, but that's the writing that I really like. I mean, long critical pieces. Reviews of films. I read The Wire magazine, not Wired, The Wire, the music magazine.
Oh, yeah.
Again, a great place for really good reflective writing.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I actually love that, because it kind of brings this whole conversation full circle, where you kind of, really kind of just fell into design and then kind of started writing. But even before that, you had this interest in criticism, and, even though you have written about music a bit, it just turns out to be a different subject, and that is kind of what you're doing now. So it's actually kind of nice.
Yeah. But I would say, as a free university, reading, excellent reviewers, and I mean, American literature. I mean, I could just spend the rest of my life just reading good American, and good American arts journalism is a wonderful, wonderful thing. So, I would happily just spend my life reading that. So it's But
I love that.
That's what I learned. Everything I know. I mean, by reading critical writers and reviewers.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you so much for doing this. Like I said at the beginning, your book was one of the first design books that I picked up, and so my interest in design writing is largely because of you. So I'm glad that we got to do this. So thank you so much.
Nice to hear. Thank you. Okay, well, it's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure talking to you. You asked really good questions.
This episode was recorded on August 11th, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud, and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.